Forget everything you think you know about nuclear escalation thresholds and what it would take to cross them in the Middle East. What Iran has just done is not what the nuclear deterrence theorists predicted would be the action that triggers planetary scale military response. It is not the detonation of a nuclear device. It is not the weaponization of fissile material. What Iran has done is struck a nuclear reactor with conventional precision munitions, and the U.S. military response that followed has shocked the world not because of its scale or its devastation, but because of its restraint. The most powerful military in the history of human civilization responded to an attack on a nuclear reactor with deliberate constraint. And the reason for that restraint, the reason that no official briefing will address and that the mainstream analysis you have been consuming completely misses, is the most important strategic story being told anywhere on Earth right now. Having spent years working in environments where nuclear facility targeting, the legal frameworks governing attacks on nuclear infrastructure, and the escalatory implications of nuclear reactor strikes were serious analytical subjects rather than hypothetical discussions, I can tell you that what just happened has placed every strategic planner, every arms control specialist, and every geopolitical decision maker on the planet in a situation they prepared for but hoped they would never face. Stay with me, because the full picture here requires understanding precisely what Iran struck, why that specific target was chosen, what the physical and radiological consequences are, and why the American response is what it is. The reactor that was struck is not a weapons production facility. It is a research reactor that has been operated under International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards monitoring. The IAEA's relationship with this facility is documented, its fuel inventory is tracked, its operational parameters are within declared specifications. The Iranian targeting of a safeguarded research reactor, rather than an unsafeguarded or military nuclear facility, is a targeting choice that carries specific legal, political, and escalatory dimensions that a weapons facility strike would not. Striking a safeguarded reactor is simultaneously a violation of international norms governing protected infrastructure and a demonstration that Iran is willing to operate outside those norms in ways that signal to every state actor in the world that the non-proliferation architecture's implicit protection of nuclear facilities is no longer operative in this conflict. The weapon used to strike the reactor is what makes the American response restraint paradoxical to casual observers, but analytically comprehensible to those who understand the escalatory logic. Iran used a conventional precision-guided munition to strike the reactor building, not a ballistic missile carrying a large warhead designed to penetrate and destroy the entire facility. A smaller precision munition that penetrated the outer containment structure of the building and created sufficient damage to the reactor's coolant systems to require emergency shutdown and coolant recovery operations. The Iranian strike was calibrated to create maximum political and diplomatic effect, maximum violation of the norms protecting nuclear facilities, with minimum actual radiological release and minimum physical damage to the reactor itself. Let me walk you through exactly what this calibrated targeting tells us about Iranian strategic intent, because the restraint in the attack is at least as analytically significant as the attack itself. Iranian planners chose a nuclear reactor strike knowing exactly what they were doing strategically. They were not attempting to create a Chernobyl or a Fukushima. They were demonstrating the capability to strike nuclear reactors with precision sufficient to control the physical effect, and the willingness to use that capability as a strategic signaling instrument against adversaries who rely on the protection of nuclear infrastructure as part of their security architecture. The message is multi-layered. To Israel, which operates the Dimona nuclear production facility as the foundation of its existential deterrent, the message is that nuclear infrastructure is now potentially vulnerable to Iranian precision strike. To the broader international community, the message is that the norms protecting nuclear facilities from attack are negotiable in Iranian strategic calculus. To the United States, the message is that escalation into domains previously considered off-limits is available to Iranian forces. Before we go any further, I need you to understand why the US military's response shocked the planet rather than producing the massive military retaliation that conventional strategic theory would predict for an attack on nuclear infrastructure. American doctrine for responding to attacks on nuclear facilities does not have a bright line requirement for massive retaliation when the attack is on a non-American facility, and when the attack, however alarming, does not create a large-scale radiological release that threatens civilian populations. The response decision is a political and strategic calculation rather than an automatic doctrinal trigger. And the political and strategic calculation that American leadership made in the hours following the reactor strike produced a response whose restraint was itself a strategic communication. American forces conducted limited precision strikes against a narrow category of Iranian military targets, specifically the specific battery positions that were assessed as having launched the munition that struck the reactor and the command node that coordinated the strike. That is all. No broader campaign against Iranian nuclear infrastructure. No strikes against IRGC command and control broadly. No carrier-based air campaign against Iranian military targets across multiple categories. A precisely bounded, proportionate, attributable response that communicated American willingness to punish the specific action while declining to escalate to the broader campaign that Iranian escalation architects may have been hoping to trigger. What the mainstream media will not tell you is why this restrained response, which shocked observers who expected massive American retaliation, is actually the more strategically sophisticated of the available options, and why the Iranian strike architects may be less pleased with the outcome than a superficial reading of the event suggests. You think you have heard the worst of it. You have not even close. The specific character of the American response, bounded, proportionate, precisely targeted, sends a strategic message to Iranian decision makers that is in many ways more alarming for long-term Iranian interests than a massive retaliatory campaign would have been. A massive American military response to the reactor strike would have played directly into the narrative structure that Iranian strategic communication has been constructing throughout the escalation sequence. It would have confirmed Iranian framing of American military action as disproportionate and indiscriminate. It would have generated international pressure for restraint on the American side. It would have created escalatory pressure that Iranian military doctrine is structured to manage. The restrained American response denies Iranian planners the massive retaliation scenario they were potentially prepared to manage, and instead creates a strategic situation that Iranian doctrine is less optimized for. A conflict in which American escalatory discipline is demonstrated and the Iranian tactical victory in striking a nuclear reactor is accompanied by a strategic setback in which American measured response demonstrates credibility and restraint simultaneously. Keep watching, because the consequence cascade from the reactor strike extends across dimensions that the immediate crisis management focus will obscure, but that will shape the global strategic environment in profound ways. The IAEA response to the reactor strike is the first and most immediate international institutional dimension. The IAEA Director General's authority to report safeguards violations to the UN Security Council, and the Security Council's authority to impose binding obligations on member states in response, creates a legal and diplomatic process that will unfold in parallel with the immediate military dynamic. The Iranian strike on a safeguarded reactor has created a legal case for Security Council action that China and Russia will struggle to block, given the universal condemnation of attacks on safeguarded nuclear facilities that even China's own nuclear doctrine endorses. The broader non-proliferation implications are the dimension carrying the most profound, long-term strategic consequences. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty's framework rests on a set of implicit assurances that extend beyond its explicit legal obligations. One of those implicit assurances is that operating nuclear facilities within the IAEA safeguards regime provides a degree of protection from military attack by virtue of the international community's collective interest in protecting the infrastructure that makes the safeguards regime function. Iranian attack on a safeguarded reactor challenges that implicit assurance at its foundation. If safeguarded nuclear facilities can be struck with conventional precision munitions as a strategic signaling instrument, the strategic value of operating within the safeguards regime is diminished for states that might otherwise join or remain within it. The calculation for states contemplating nuclear programs or states evaluating whether to continue operating within the safeguards framework now includes an assessment of the protection that safeguards membership actually provides against military attack. If that protection has been operationally demonstrated to be insufficient, the incentive structure that the safeguards regime relies on to maintain broad participation is weakened in ways that will play out over years in the decisions of states currently at the margins of the non-proliferation architecture. The reality that no official briefing will address is that the most consequential long-term impact of what just happened may not be in the Middle East theater where it occurred, but in the proliferation dynamics of other regions where states are making calculations about nuclear programs and safeguards regime participation that will be influenced by what Iran has demonstrated is possible and what the international community has demonstrated it will do in response. Having spent years working on arms control and non-proliferation issues at the intersection of military analysis and diplomatic practice, I can tell you that what just happened to a safeguarded nuclear reactor represents a threshold crossing in the global security environment whose implications will be worked through in arms control and non-proliferation policy for decades. The immediate military dimension of the reactor strike and the American response will dominate the news cycle. The structural damage to the non-proliferation architecture will develop more slowly and will receive less immediate attention, but will prove more consequential for global security in the long run. The decisions being made right now in the American security establishment, in the IAEA's Vienna headquarters, in the UN Security Council, in the capitals of every state with a nuclear program or an interest in the non-proliferation regime's health, will determine whether what just happened becomes a bounded violation of nuclear infrastructure protection norms from which the norms can recover, or a precedent that fundamentally changes the global calculus around the protection and targeting of nuclear facilities. The next 72 hours will produce the first indicators of which trajectory this is on. Watch them carefully because the nuclear reactor strike and the American response that shocked the planet represent a hinge moment in global security whose full implications will unfold over years and whose management in these first days and weeks will shape the institutional and normative environment for nuclear security for a generation. The specific radiological situation created by the reactor strike demands careful technical explanation that will not appear in mainstream coverage focused on the political drama. When a research reactor's coolant systems are damaged through precision strike, the immediate concern is whether the reactor fuel rods are exposed to conditions that could produce significant radiological release. Modern research reactors incorporate multiple independent shutdown systems designed to insert neutron-absorbing control rods into the reactor core automatically when coolant system anomalies are detected. These passive safety systems do not require operator action and do not require external power to function. Their activation, which occurred within seconds of the coolant system damage, placed the reactor in a subcritical state that prevents chain reaction continuation. The residual heat removal challenge remains even after subcriticality is achieved, because reactor fuel continues to produce decay heat from radioactive fission products for hours after shutdown. Managing that decay heat without adequate coolant flow is the challenge that produced the Fukushima crisis in conditions incomparably more severe than what is present in the reactor that Iran struck. The technical assessment from what can be observed through open source information suggests that emergency coolant systems function sufficiently to prevent the core temperature excursion that would produce significant fuel cladding failure and the consequent radiological release that would create a public health emergency. What this technical assessment means for the strategic situation is that Iranian planners achieved the political and diplomatic effect of striking a nuclear reactor, the violation of norms protecting nuclear infrastructure. the demonstration of capability to reach and damage nuclear facilities, the signal to Israel about Damona's vulnerability, without creating the massive radiological release that would have transformed the event from a strategic signaling exercise into an environmental catastrophe demanding a categorically different international and American response. The calibration between achieving maximum political effect and avoiding the radiological release that would have triggered maximum escalatory response reflects exactly the kind of sophisticated strategic targeting assessment that Western analysts have been slow to credit to Iranian military planners. Before we go any further, I need you to understand what Iranian planners risked by making this calibrated attack, because understanding the risk they accepted is essential for understanding the strategic confidence that the attack reflects. Calibrated precision strikes against nuclear reactor coolant systems require an exceptionally detailed understanding of the specific reactor's design, the layout of its coolant systems, the location and capability of its emergency cooling systems, and the precise quantity and velocity of munition effect required to damage the coolant systems without creating the conditions for significant fuel damage. Getting this calibration wrong in either direction produces either a failed attack that does not penetrate the reactor building adequately to create coolant system damage, or an attack that creates more damage than intended and produces the significant radiological release that transforms the strategic environment. Iranian targeting planning achieved the calibrated outcome. That achievement required either access to detailed technical design documentation for the specific reactor or extensive analysis and simulation of reactor system vulnerability based on open-source technical information combined with whatever intelligence collection was available about the specific facility. The intelligence and technical analysis achievement required to plan and execute a calibrated attack on a nuclear reactor with controlled effect is an order of magnitude more sophisticated than any conventional military targeting challenge. It required integrating nuclear engineering knowledge, precision targeting capability, and strategic assessment of acceptable versus unacceptable radiological outcomes into a single operational plan. The fact that Iranian planners achieved this integration successfully tells you something fundamental about the technical sophistication and strategic seriousness of Iranian military planning capability that Western assessments have persistently undervalued. The international community's response to the reactor strike is developing across multiple simultaneous channels, each of which carries its own implications for the strategic trajectory of the crisis. The IAEA Emergency Inspection Team is en route to assess the reactor's condition and determine the scope of safeguards violations involved in the strike. The UN Security Council is being convened for an emergency session at which the United States will present a resolution condemning the attack on safeguarded nuclear infrastructure. European allies are issuing condemnations while simultaneously pressing for diplomatic channels that can address the underlying conflict before the next escalation step. And regional states are processing the demonstration that nuclear reactor strikes are now part of the operational toolkit in this conflict, with the alarm that this demonstration justifiably produces. What I have not yet explained is the specific dimension of the American restrained response that carries the most important strategic message for Iranian decision makers about what the United States is actually prepared to do if escalation continues past the reactor strike. American strategic communication following the restrained military response has been carefully constructed to accomplish two simultaneous objectives that are in some tension with each other. The first objective is demonstrating that the restrained response reflects strategic choice rather than military incapacity, communicating to Iranian